Sunday nights we're teaching on Revelation, and has brought us to a kind of crossroads in a lot of different things. The book of Revelation teaches us about Christ being revealed to the church, and it's not just about the end of time. I keep saying that. Heard somebody on TV say, well, he's teaching on Revelation about the end of time. Somebody was talking on one of these Discovery channels and talking about something about what preachers preached and why he preached on the end of time out of Revelation. I don't even think of the end of time when I think of Revelation. I think of the end of time chapters when I'm teaching. There's more end of time prophecy in Matthew the 24th chapter, Mark the 13th chapter, Luke the 21st chapter. These are pinpointing the end of time more than even the book of Revelation. Revelation is telling us what's going to be going on from the time of John around 96 AD. And this is what everybody misses if you go back to that first chapter of Revelation. First chapter of Revelation, and the scripture says, verse 1, the revelation of Jesus Christ. It's not revelations, it's one revelation of Jesus Christ. It's the revelation, no S on the end of it. What are you teaching on? Our pastor's teaching on revelations. Well, there's only one of them. The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave unto him to show unto his servants things which must shortly, or in a very short period of time, must come to pass. And he sent and signified it by his angel unto his servant John. And he's saying shortly in 97 AD, in 98 AD, in 99, in 100 AD, up to 200, up to 300 AD, up to 1500 AD, up to 2000 AD. The book of Revelation is covering the time of John to the end of time. That's what it's about. And I keep saying, and I'm going to write it on the board again, when you're reading Revelation, you will not understand if you think Revelation is a sequence of chapters. When you have chapter 1 and 2 follows chapter 1, and the events of chapter 3 follow 2, and the events of chapter 4 follow 3, and 5, and so on, and 6. That's not true. Some chapters follow, but the events are not in a sequence. They do not follow the pattern of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because, let me say it one more time. In the book of Revelation, you can think of the end of time, but you've got chapters like chapter 12. In chapter 12, you see Satan cast out of heaven by Michael the archangel. Well, that's not a future event. Chapter 12 of Revelation is a panoramic view from one end of the Bible to the other. That's what it is. You've got Satan cast into the earth. Well, that's not some future thing. He is the prince of the power of the air now. The spirit that goeth about seeking whom he may devour. That's Satan now. So, where was Satan cast into the earth? Where do we find the very nature of Satan in the earth? The first time we find it. You find it in Genesis 1, verse 2. You find the nature of Satan. That the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. Darkness is the nature of Satan. Besides that, when you get over to chapter 3, don't we find Satan in some form there? Isn't he in the form of a serpent? Well, when he's cast into the earth, he corrupts everything in the earth. The Bible itself says the stars are not clean, the moon is not clean, man is not clean. So where did all this come from that man is not clean? Well, I didn't mean to get into this, but I'll just go ahead and say it. Genesis 1:1. Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created. Created. Well, create is a righteous word. It's a righteous word. And the Jews said that God breathed everything, that he breathed it out of his mouth. He created everything out of nothing, out of just his breath. And they call that ex nihilo, N-I-H-I-L-I-O, that he created everything out of nothing, and that he created it. This word create is the word bara. That's Hebrew. Ex nihilo is a Hebrew saying. And this word create is the word bara. It means to cut and make fat. Now, fat to the Jew wasn't the cellulite around your waist. Fat was the richest. The richest crop, the richest cattle. It was the very best. It was the best cut of beef. It was the best. This word bara means to cut and make fat. Well, that's a righteous word because from bara we get the word B-E-R-I-Y-T-H, berith. And that's the word covenant. So God began his covenant with his people in the first verse of Genesis. Well, when you get to verse 2, I'm just simply showing you Revelation 12. You get to Genesis 1 verse 2. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. Now, there's not one of those words, without form, void, or darkness, that's a righteous word. That's the nature of Satan. Now, I've listened to some supposed to be greatly educated men like R.C. Sproul one day. He said, we see no reason anywhere in this text where that the word was should be translated became. Yes, we do, R.C. Became, not become. Became. The reason it has to become, became. The earth has to become without form and void because of a couple of points. That's because in the first verse of Genesis, create, bara, is a righteous word. All of a sudden we get to the second verse of Genesis and we've got unrighteousness there, don't we? Unrighteousness did not come out of the mouth of God. The chaos of verse 2 did not come out of God's mouth. It did not. When you go to Isaiah 45 and 18, you can read that with me, and I'm still talking about Revelation. Isaiah 45, verse 18. 45 and 18. For thus saith the Lord that created the heavens, God himself that formed the earth and made it, he hath established it, he created it not in vain. This is a reference to the first verse of Genesis, isn't it? God did not create the earth in vain. He formed it to be inhabited. I am the Lord, there's none else. Now, he's saying he did not create in vain. That word in vain, Isaiah 45 and verse 18, He created not in vain. The word in vain is the word T-O-H-U-W. Tohu. This word without form is the word tohu. So Isaiah is saying when God created the earth, His creation, His forming comes after. His forming comes after verse 2, but He did not create in the first verse, tohu in the second verse. That's what Isaiah 45:18 says, doesn't it? Isaiah 45:18 says that God did not create in the first verse what's going on in the second verse. That's what it says, doesn't it? Huh? Isn't that what it says? Y'all understand what I'm saying? If He did not create in vain or tohu, He creates the heavens and the earth, verse 1, and then the earth is without form, it's tohu. So tohu, or without form, did not come out of the mouth of God in verse 1. Did it? It did not. Therefore, and I'm not going to go into it, I go into this in teaching on Genesis 1. Therefore, in between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, you're not even to the first day yet, are you? If you're not to the first day, then there's not 6 days of creation. There's a creation, and between verse 1 and 2 can be 1 billion years. The Bible does not teach 6 days of creation. It teaches 6 days of making and forming. It teaches God picking up the earth. In fact, I'll just go ahead and say it. The earth is the picture. The earth, in verse 1, is a picture of the elect of God. And then verse 2, darkness comes upon the depth of our hearts. Darkness comes on the depths of our hearts. And then God says, let there be light in the heart of my elect. And then He begins 6 days. 6 is the number of man. He begins 6 days of making and forming. You're not going to find days of creation, even in the English. In your English King James Bible, it's not there. Making and forming. The 6 days are the work of a potter, not creating, because he did not create tohu. So the point I'm getting at in Revelation is when you see the earth was without form, the word has to, and that word is translated at times became. That it became, or it's something that came afterwards. And because God did not create tohu, and because the earth becomes tohu, so the earth has to become without form after God created it, because without form and void is not the work of God. That's the work of Satan. We know that God ordains everything, don't we? But that's Satan's work. So when Satan enters this sphere, he's cast into the earth, and everything is polluted. The dust of the earth is corrupt, and this is the chaos. And then when God says, let there be light, that's not when He created light. He created light in the first verse. He's saying, let the light in, because darkness is upon the face of the deep, and something is blocking the light. Most of your scientists say that at one time there was a cloud around the earth. So when God says, let there be light in our lives, that's spiritual circumcision, and Christ comes into our life. Now, I go through this when I'm teaching on Genesis, the first chapter. But I'm not going to go into that any further now. I just wanted to say that so that when we get to Genesis 3, I'm going to put this much of predestination in this. When you get to Genesis, the 3rd chapter, and Satan is there in the form of the serpent. When you find Satan there in the form of the serpent, well, First, let me give you something before that. Genesis 2. When God picks up the dust of the ground and forms Adam out of the dust of the ground, He forms him out of chaotic dust, doesn't He? So therefore, when you get to Genesis 3, Adam is made out of chaos. The dust is chaotic. It's full of Satan. It's full of sin. And it opposes God, doesn't it? So in Genesis 3, well, one other thing. God tells Adam in Genesis 2, you cannot eat of this tree that appeals to the flesh. But you will, because I made you out of chaotic dust. I made you out of chaos. So Adam had no choice. God said, thou shalt not, and when you do, you're going to die. And I've had people say, well, why would God do all this? Why would He just make man this way? And why would He put him through all this and the trials if God can do things the way He wants? That's a crazy question. God says that He's chosen us in Him before the foundation of the world, that we should be holy and without blame before Him in love, having predestinated us unto the adoption of children by Jesus Christ unto Himself, according to the good pleasure of His will. Let me just ask you this. When God created man, could He have created him out of something besides corrupt dust if He'd wanted to? Well, He could have made him some plastic, couldn't He? He could have, He's God. He could poof something out of there. He could have got him some clean dirt out of nothing, couldn't He? That was His plan and His program. That's what He wants to do. He says, I will do all my pleasure. I do what I want to do. Now, I heard my father, who was an old country Baptist preacher, say, we as Baptists believe that the earth is 6,000 years old. That's the dumb statement. Even an English Bible doesn't teach that. You can't find 6 days of creation. You find 6 days of making and forming, where God would take the waters under the firmament and separate them from the waters above the firmament. And that was where He reserved the waters above the firmament for the flood, 1,356 years after Adam. So when He makes Adam and He tells him, thou shalt not, Adam had no choice but to sin, because he's made out of corruption, isn't he? He's made out of this without form stuff. That's what you're made out of, without form and void. So when Satan is cast into the earth, in the 12th chapter of Revelation, you have to look at the very first time that you find the nature of Satan. When is he in earth's sphere or atmosphere? Genesis 1-2, that's where he comes into the earth. So chapter 12, when Michael casts him to the earth, that's a panoramic view of all time. Huh?
Fits in between 1 and 2, Revelation 12.
What'd you say?
Revelation 12 fits in between Genesis.
Well, Revelation 12 is just a picture. It's a panoramic view of all time, but it picks out points. It shows that Satan is cast into the earth at some place and time, so you have to find the nature of Satan. Where's the first place you find his nature? Verse 2 of the Bible. So somewhere between 1 and 2, God casts Satan into the earth by Michael out of chapter 12 of Revelation. Can you see that? It's not that hard. I don't know why these preachers can't see. I'm going to go back and teach on Genesis 1 here again before long. Now, I'm just simply trying to show you what I was going to show you again. So when you're studying, in fact, in chapter 12, you've got the woman, that's Israel, that brings forth the man-child, and he's going to rule the world with a rod of iron. And the Jews don't necessarily even put their chapters in sequence, because you find that Jesus is brought forth in the chapter, and he's going to rule the world with a rod of iron, and he ascends up to God. And then it tells you about how, do you ever in a conversation say, well, are you talking along and say, oh, let me tell you about something back here? Well, they did the same thing, because you'll find that Satan cast into the earth in Revelation 12 comes in the text after Jesus is raised up to, and he's resurrected to go to be with the Lord. And then he comes up and tells you how Satan is cast into the earth, and then how that he goes after the woman, which is the church, and tries to devour her and so forth. And there's a place for her. God makes a place for it. Now, let me erase this. Also in Revelation, if you look at Revelation like it's one chapter, the events follow on the heels of the previous chapter. That's what's wrong with these so-called prophecy teachers. They get real confused. You'll find the end of time. I'm going to put it on the board again for those of you who haven't seen it. You're going to find the end of time in Revelation 6. What do you mean the end of time in Revelation 6? We ain't at the end of the book yet. That's because these are not sequential. You find men crying for the rocks and the mountains to fall upon them, hide them from the face of him that sitteth on the throne in the end of chapter 6. Then in Revelation 8, you find the end of time. You find the mountain, Babylon, the burning mountain cast into the sea, don't you? But you also find that mountain later on in the 18th chapter. And then you find in Revelation 10, in verse 7, well, actually verse 5 and 6, where Christ puts one foot on the land, the other on the sea, and says, time will be no more. I think that's the end of time, isn't it? And then the seventh trumpet sounds, and the mystery of God is finished. And then Revelation 11, there in verse 15, where the seventh trumpet sounds, and Babylon collapses there in Revelation 11. Then Revelation 14, you find that that Christ comes back to tread the winepress outside Jerusalem. Well, that's the same thing. The same time factor is 19, where he comes back on a great white horse. Well, in Revelation 16, you have Armageddon, and you've got Babylon being destroyed there, and you got the earthquake through. You got the earthquake in chapter 6. You got the earthquake in chapter 11. You got the earthquake in chapter 16. The same earthquake that destroys Babylon. Then from 16, you got a parenthesis, Revelation 17 and Revelation 18. Well, 18, we see the end of time because we see the destruction of Babylon. Revelation 17 is a description of Babylon. And then, so you've got the end of time in Revelation 18. This is like a parenthesis describing Babylon and her fall. So you put Revelation 18 with these others, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then 8, you've got the end of time in Revelation 19, where Christ comes back on a great white horse. The end of time in each one of those chapters is just a different viewpoint. John is just giving different viewpoints of the same events. Now we've been talking about, and I just want to say that again to you. We've been talking about the 10 horns of the beast of Revelation 13 and Revelation 17. Now, the beast, one more time. You got 2 beasts of Revelation 13. Revelation 13. You got the first beast that's like a lion, a bear, and a leopard. And that's not a man. That is a world-ruling system. It's a system. Then you got the second beast. And this beast has the authority of the first beast. And this beast speaks like this is a 2-horned beast. 2 horns like a lamb. It looks like Jesus. And this is the false doctrine or the false teaching system. I am burning up, is it? I mean, I feel like I'm in a desert. Somebody needs to turn that air down over or something. It is just, I feel like it's about 90 degrees up here. Need to put it down some because I am, I feel like I'm feeding the flames of something up here. All right. The two-horned beast looks like Jesus, but it speaks like a dragon. Speaks like a dragon. Of course, dragon just means a snake. Snake. Or a serpent. It is the word drakon, D-R-A-K-O-N. And drakon, the writers believe that the serpents would fascinate their prey and kind of hypnotize and put them in a hypnotic state. So they said that drakon, some of the writers said it meant to fascinate. Well, that makes a person feel good. And that's what the false teaching system is like. We're talking about this beast up here, the first beast. We've gone through this beast extensively. This second beast is the world system of religion. You can call that the city of Babylon, because the city of Babylon is the religious system. And they always say good words and fair speeches and fascinate everyone. And it looks like Jesus. It's another Jesus, another spirit, another gospel. Now, we're talking about the lion, the bear, and the leopard. We know who that is from Daniel 7. Daniel 7, that is the lion, bear, and leopard of Daniel 7. And it is Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. Rome is not mentioned as an animal. Rome is mentioned in Daniel 7 as the beast with iron teeth, and it destroys all the others. Now, I want to show you something. I want to call your attention. If the beast is over here in Daniel 7, and it's got 10 horns over in Daniel 7, it's the same 10 horns in Daniel 7 as the 10 horns at the end of time, isn't it? It's no different in the horns. I don't know why. It's kind of like if you got a mark of the beast over here in Revelation, in the book of Revelation 13, and you got the same beast over here in Daniel 7, do you think you have the mark of the beast there? Huh? Well, certainly you do. Of course, the word mark, I believe I brought it out this morning, is charagma. Charagma. It means an etching. And they would etch the name of the person that you were serving up on your forehead or your hand. And it comes from the word karax, which means a stake on a boundary. So and the Bible has much to say about boundary lines. Well, the beast in the garden was more subtle. The serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field, and there was a boundary line in the garden. That boundary was set by God. You can eat of these trees here. Don't go beyond the mark and eat of that boundary over there. So if you got a mark, mark is the same thing as name. I don't think I brought this out in a long time. Onoma is the word name. Onoma means character or authority. And when someone etches a person, that means to carve into their forehead or puts a stake. That means if you had in your forehead in the ancient world A mark, that meant your master with this person over here and you went according to his laws. When the Bible says that we put God's law before our eyes, or we're sealed with his mark, that's an old ancient term that meant in the mind. The mark of God is in our mind. We're sealed with God's mark in our mind. Now let me show you that name and mark, name and charagma, which is the word mark, are the same thing. Look over here in Revelation 13. Revelation 13. What you would etch in a person's forehead was the authority that he followed. When we take God's mark, his word is written in our minds. That's having the mark of God. The mark of the beast is that tree we talked about this morning. All that's in the world. That's Satan's mark. If the beast is here at the end of time, and the beast was here in Daniel 7, and it's the same lion, bear, and leopard, then there was a mark of the beast over there, wasn't there? And if the beast has got 10 horns over here, that's the same beast. It had 10 horns over here, didn't it? Certainly it did. You don't have the beast without 10 horns anywhere. It's always got the 10 horns. All right. Now look here at chapter 13. Chapter 13, verse 17. No man might buy or sell save he that had the mark, the charagma, or. What does or mean? Huh? Yeah, else. Or here's another or. If I said Jim or the pastor, same thing. He says that had the mark or the name of the beast. He's saying the mark is the name, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name. And name means character, authority, and when you etch something on a man, you etch a character or an authority. It showed the authority that you served. So the mark of the beast is the same thing as the name. Well, name is the word onoma, and it means a character or authority. And when we take on the name of Christ, we take his character or his authority. It doesn't mean, say Jesus. Can you say Jesus? We take it on his name. Let's talk about Jesus. So let's sing about Jesus, Jesus. Something about that name. Get out of here. That's not what that's talking about. It's talking about taking on his authority, his word. This is the mark of God. We're sealed with this. It's not something tricky if these guys would define things. Now, we're talking about the 10 horns. I'm going to make it real short. I'm talking about the 10 horns because I got some places for us to go. Now, for those of you that haven't been here while I've taught on the 10 horns, let me just see if I can't paraphrase everything. I don't want to go through it all. I've got dozens of tapes on this. I mean, I've been in this 10 horn thing for a long time. 10 horn. That's something. That's a 2-bit cowboy. 10 horn. I just thought of that. He's a 10 horn. Okay. All right. Horn does not mean something that sticks out of the head. It's not what it means. The majority of the time when you look at the word horn in the Bible, it's an idiom. It's an idiom. It's a word that's used to represent something else other than what you see there, what you think of. Let me read the word idiom to you one more time. I've got it in the front of my Bible. It's out of Webster's. Idiom, the language or dialect of a people or region, the usual way in which the words of a particular language are joined together to express thought. Now, metaphor, this would probably be more of a metaphor, a figure of speech containing an implied comparison in which a word or phrase ordinarily or primarily used of one thing is applied to another. Now, horn is normally used to show something either coming out of an animal's head, or it's something you go beep beep, or it's something you toot on you blow a horn and it makes a noise. Horn, when you look up the word horn, and you can look it up here in McClintock and Strong, you look it up in any number of books, and they'll tell you that the word horn means strength. It means power. It means authority. Now the beast, in order for the beast to exist, Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome, it had to get power somewhere to exist. It had to get power and strength. It had to get existence. Existence. Well, the Scripture tells us that the nation that had all of the power, the nation that had the power. Well, let me read one verse for those of you. I'm not reading it for those of you that know, but go to Zechariah. I'll just read this. Zechariah is probably the best illustration of actually what a horn is. Next to the last book of the Old Testament. This is the best illustration of what horns mean. In verse 18, chapter 1, Zechariah. Then lifted I up mine eyes and saw, and behold, 4 horns. And I said unto the angel that talked with me, what be these 4 horns? And he answered me, these are the horns which have scattered Judah, Israel, and Jerusalem. Well, what were the nations that scattered them? Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome. Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome is one beast. You do know that, don't you? Verse 18 through 18, 19. Well, let's just go ahead and read the rest of it. And the Lord showed me 4 carpenters. Then said I, what is he talking about? Guys with hammers in their, with their jeans on and their utility belt? Is that what he's talking about? This is metaphor. Saw 4 carpenters. Then said I, what came these to do? He spake, saying, these 4 carpenters are the horns. Boy, that wouldn't make any sense unless you understood that the writer here is writing in metaphoric language. He's using one thing to express another. Well, we do that, don't we? Man, that's cool. What do you mean? You mean it's 38 degrees? Is that what you mean? No, he's cool, man. What is he, 38 degrees? No, cool. See, we do the same thing, don't we? Now, who in the world came up with cool? I don't know. I don't know how in the world the word cool can mean cool. Do you? Huh? Yeah, smooth. Desirable. No, cool is stupid. Cool is dumb. I keep saying that. Cool is when you're young and you think you got it together and you don't know nothing. Cool is dumb. These are the horns which have scattered Judah, so that no man did lift up his head. But these are come to fray them, to cast out the horns of the Gentiles. See, everybody's horns, aren't they? To cast out the power of the Gentiles, which lifted up their horn over the land of Judah, to scatter it. Horns are powers and authorities. Now, one nation had the power to conquer every other nation on the face of the earth, including all of the empires. And that was Israel, wasn't it? In Deuteronomy 28, and in Leviticus 26. These are sister chapters. They're sisters. They say basically a lot of the same things. Both chapters, the Bible says, if you're obedient to my words and keep all my statutes, Israel, as you go in to possess the land that I gave your father Abraham, I'll bless your crops, your fields, your womb. You'll have healthy children. I'll bless you when you go out and when you come in. And Israel, you'll go against your enemy one way, and they will flee 7 ways. And it matters not how many of them there are or how big they are. because I'm your king. I'm on your side. And I've got an arsenal you wouldn't believe. Lightning bolts, fire from heaven. No one. I've got a death angel that can kill as many men as I want him to kill in one night. And he did that in that 19th chapter of 2 Kings. Remember that? He went down through the camp of Sennacherib. All of these hundreds of thousands of Assyrians were encamped against Jerusalem. Jerusalem, just a little old city. But Jerusalem had two things. They had two nuclear warheads. One was named Hezekiah, and the other was Isaiah, two of the most righteous men who ever lived in the Old Testament. And Assyria is going to attack these two men. I'd rather take on Mike Tyson and Evander Holyfield and about a dozen of these guys all at once than to try to do what they did. And I couldn't get to first base with those guys. Because when they came up against Hezekiah and Isaiah, Hezekiah got nervous. And he said, what will we do? He tried to pacify the king by paying him tribute. Sennacherib was his name. He said, I'll go talk to Isaiah. And Isaiah was the prophet of God, righteous man. Isaiah prayed a little short prayer to God, and he said, Hezekiah, you can go home and go to bed. And the next morning, the Assyrian king woke up, and he had 185,000 dead soldiers on the ground out there where Michael the death angel came down through there. And he killed all of them. Now that's better than karate. When you think you're tough, you're not. God's tough. So when Israel was outnumbered, God did miraculous things for them. He said, whenever I've got righteous people ruling, and even when he had unrighteous people, he was long-suffering to a point. And then he said, that's it, I've had my fill of you. He put up with northern Israel. And we keep saying this. We keep saying this, that you had a united kingdom with Saul, David, and Solomon. It was one nation. Well, Saul was the wrong king. He came from the tribe of Benjamin. And Saul is king. They asked for a king in this 8th chapter of 1 Samuel. Then Saul is chosen by God in the 9th chapter. And then he goes out and fights his first battle in the 11th chapter. And then in the 12th chapter, Samuel steps down. They anoint Saul king. And God, from the beginning, said, I'm your king. You don't need a man king. But the people kept saying, give us a man king. So God said, I'll give you a king, and he'll be from the tribe of Benjamin. Well, that's the wrong tribe. Genesis, the 49th chapter, says the scepter will not depart from Judah. So God had to plan his turn. He had to cause Saul's heart to be evil so he could repent of making Saul king. It doesn't mean God wept and cried. It meant he had to turn from making him king. And when he turned from making him king, he said, I've got me a king among the tribe of Bethlehem, Judah. The king will come from Judah, and from then on, all of the right kings would come from Judah, and everyone else would be said to be of the seed of David. Well, Solomon was David's son by Bathsheba. Well, that's amazing, isn't it? David committed murder and adultery to get Bathsheba. And then Solomon is the king of Israel, and he builds the temple, and God had that planned before the foundation of the world. So therefore, David's sin was planned by God before the foundation of the world. People don't like that, do they? But he did. Then Solomon, in the 11th chapter of 1 Kings, he allows his wives, 700 wives and 300 combines. That's the way I went to put it. Combines. David was a farmer. 300 concubines. 300 concubines, those were secondary wives. 1,000 wives. And he let them keep all of their Shemosh, Molech. Their Christmas gods is what I call it. They're Baal gods and Ashtaroth gods. So God split the kingdom under his son Rehoboam. Northern Israel was 10 tribes led by Jeroboam. And the 10 northern tribes, the head of northern Israel, and the leading tribe would be Ephraim, the second-born son of Joseph. So whenever you see Joseph or Ephraim after they're dead, it's talking about northern Israel. Or if it says Israel in the context of Scripture, after the split comes, after the split, after Solomon, always northern Israel will be referred to either as Samaria, Joseph, Ephraim, or Israel. Even though southern Judah is Israel, anytime you see Israel after the split, it's talking about northern Israel. Because Judah will be called Judah. Southern Judah was made up of two tribes. Judah, the tribe of Judah, and the tribe of Benjamin. Judah was David's fourth-born son, and Benjamin was Jacob's. Judah was Jacob's fourth-born son, and Benjamin was Jacob's 12th son. That was southern Israel. Northern Israel was 10 tribes. Southern Judah was 2 tribes, or southern Israel. Well, here's the way the divine lineage of kings goes. David, Solomon. Rehoboam, Abijah, Asa, Jehoshaphat, Jehoram, Ahaziah, Joash. We skipped her. She's a liar. Amaziah, Uzziah. These are all fathers and sons all the way down through here. These, northern Israel, you just had to be tough enough to come in there and kill the man before you and overthrow him and take over the throne. These are illegitimate kings in northern Israel. The kingdom, the true king comes out of southern Judah. You say, what are these people up here good for? They're led by Ephraim, and Ephraim has the ownership of Israel. We're not going to go into that right now. Now, all right. The Bible says that Israel can whip anybody they want to as long as they obey God. But when they disobey, then God says, first I'll send the sword, the famine, and the pestilence, the first 3 judgments, and I'll send them over and over and over. And he sent those for 500 years. And finally he says, I'll send the 4th judgment one time, and that will be the beast. And of course we know that Babylon came in. Now when Israel disobeyed God, it was because the 10 northern tribes, through Ahab, marrying Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal of Tyre, when he married her, they brought Baal in the grove in and made that the national religion of Israel. They made Christmas the national religion of Israel. Or Baal in the grove, same thing. And then their daughter married down into southern Judah and took that godly system with them. So, the 10 horns, each one of these 10 northern tribes was considered an army in itself, and each one of them was a horn. So those horns, these 10 horns here, gave up their power to the beast, didn't they? Israel had the power to conquer the world. And they could go one-on-one with somebody, but God would not allow them to go and just to be abusive to people and just to take over. They were there to defend themselves, and as long as they obeyed God, they could conquer everyone. But they gave their power to the beast. The beast only got its power from one source. It didn't get its power. And in that 17th chapter of Revelation, the Bible says that the 10 horns gave the beast its power and its strength and its existence. The beast had one source of power. It came from Israel. When Israel disobeyed God, that's the only place it came from. Now we went through that, and if you want more on that, but I'm going to show you this. I'm taking you to places in the Old Testament so you can see how that God is not going to. God said you'll conquer, but it won't be out of your pride. Now let me show you something here. It's something that confuses a lot of people. Go over here to 2 Samuel. I'm going to show you something. 2 Samuel. Now, if there's anybody new, about the power of God, it was David when he was young. But he gets old and he gets a little contrary and a little bit proud. Well, that's easy to do after you think, I got God on my side. I can conquer. I'm got it together. But David was humbled by God. Look here in 2 Samuel 24. And again, and is a conjunction that connects this chapter with the previous chapter. But let me go ahead and show you this. Again, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and God moved David against Israel to say, go number Israel and Judah. Now, he is speaking of God. He provoked David to number Israel. Now, let me show you. Let's look at 2 Chronicles. Let's look and see what 2 Chronicles says. Not 2 Chronicles. 1 Chronicles 21. Now, let's see what 2 Chronicles says. 1 Chronicles, 1 Chronicles 21. Now, it says that the Lord moved David to go number Israel. It doesn't matter how many is in Israel if David is obedient, isn't it? Because they can whip anyone. Well, look here in chapter 21, verse 1. And Satan stood up against Israel and provoked David to number Israel. It says that Satan provoked him here. It says God made him to number Israel over there in chapter 24 of 2 Samuel. Let me show you the way you have to look at this. Well, let me go ahead and read a little bit of this in chapter 21. David said to Joab and to the rulers of the people, go number Israel from Beersheba even to Dan, and bring the number of them to me, that I may know it. And Joab answered, the Lord make his people 100 times so many more as they be. But my lord the king, are they not all my Lord's servants? Why then doth my Lord require this thing? Why will he be a cause of trespass to Israel? David is trespassing the law of God. It's not numbers that makes Israel conquer its enemies. Nevertheless, the king's word prevailed against Joab. Therefore, wherefore Joab departed. Remember Joab, that's David's nephew. And that's David's commanding general. Remember that? Joab departed and went throughout all Israel and came to Jerusalem. And Joab gave the sum of the number of the people unto David. And all they of Israel were 1,000,000, and 100,000 men that drew the sword. And Judah was 410,000 men that drew the sword. And Levi and Benjamin counted he not among them, for the king's word was abominable to Joab. So Joab is not giving him a true count. Now, I'm not going to read all this chapter. Let's go back over. It says Satan here. The word Satan is the word Satan, spelled the same way in the Hebrew. It means adversary. Now, at this point, David is being proud of how many he has and what great men he has in the army of Israel. David evidently is trying to strut and say, and here David is at the end of his life. He's trying to strut and say, look at all that I have done. And God has to remind David. That word Satan means an adversary. Let's go over here. Let me show you something over here in 1 Samuel 29. 1 Samuel 29. Go back to 1 Samuel 29.
29 or 24?
29. Go to 1 Samuel 29. Now, let me read a little bit of this. And the Philistines gathered together all their armies to Aphek, and the Israelites pitched by a fountain which is in Jezreel. And the lords of the Philistines passed on by hundreds and by thousands. And David and his men passed on in the reward with Achish. Reward means hinder or last part. Hinder or last. Now what's happening here? Let me show you what's happening. Saul is the king of Israel. Well, let me take some time to explain this. Saul was picked out, 1 Samuel 8. They said, give us a king. God picks him out in chapter 9. Says, here is Saul. Here's your captain, Saul. He's of the tribe of Benjamin. That's the wrong tribe. And then Saul begins his first battle in the 11th chapter. And then he's made king. His official coronation is in the 12th chapter. And then he's given some instructions by God in the 13th chapter. I'm not going to go through that. That'll take me too long. We'll do that on another day. And he ignores those instructions by God concerning Samuel in order to go to Gilgal in the center of Israel when he hears the message that the Philistines... Well, let me just go ahead and say this. The word was in the 13th chapter that David is to go to Gilgal. That's right in the center of Israel. Now you've got Philistines all around Israel. You got the Philistines down here and you got the Ammonites up here. So the word was anytime there was a need to gather together the armies of Israel, go to Gilgal. That was in the center of Israel. And Samuel told Saul to go to Gilgal and wait for him to come there. Well, Saul gets in a hurry and he begins his demise in the kingdom in the 13th chapter. He begins his downfall because Samuel said, I am the priest of God. I will be there to offer sacrifice and God will lead us into the battle against these Philistines. Well, Saul got bent out of shape. He had 3,000 in his army, and he saw hundreds of thousands of Philistines. So he said, Samuel told him to go there and wait 7 days at Gilgal. And he got in a hurry, and about 6.5 days were up. And he said, I got to do something real quick. And Saul is of the tribe of Benjamin. He is not a priest. And he runs and tries to get a priest to come and offer sacrifice to God. And he ignores the commandment of God. And Samuel tells him when he gets to Gilgal, he says, you have messed up with God. You're starting off your kingdom on the wrong foot. He started in disobedience. By the time you get to the 15th chapter, the 14th chapter, he does some real asinine things there. By the 15th chapter, he doesn't go down to Amalek and utterly destroy the Amalekites. He doesn't kill all the sheep and the goats. And he doesn't kill all the babies. Now, why would God want Saul to go down to Amalek and kill all of these pagans? No. What's wrong with those babies down there? They hadn't committed any sin. They were, like Willie said, pollution. Israel lived by all of these quarantine laws. You can't trust the Amalekites, who are a bunch of pagans. They're not quarantining anything. If anyone comes to Israel alive with disease, they can scatter disease throughout all Israel. So God says, go down there and utterly destroy Amalek. Kill all the sheep and the goats and everybody there. Well, Saul comes back in the 15th chapter. He comes back and he's got King Agag with him. What's Agag doing here? Samuel says, I thought we told you to go down and utterly destroy Amalek. He said, well, I did, but the people, they wanted to offer sacrifice to God, and I couldn't help it. I was just the king. You liar. I mean, you're the king and you can't keep it from happening? It's because he wanted some of the good sheep and some of the good goats. And he brought Agag back, and Samuel said, give me a sword. And he hacked Agag to the ground. A real nice prophet hacked the king to pieces. And he didn't walk away either. Believe that. Well, that's the end of Saul's kingdom as far as God is concerned. He's out of the picture. The 16th chapter, David is chosen by God. Samuel is sent down to the house of Jesse for him to be king. Well, Saul hears about it. He knows this is going on. So David is actually officially king in the 16th chapter. In the 16th chapter of 1 Samuel. He's the king. And then in the 17th chapter, David goes out and has his big fight with Goliath. And he kills Goliath in the 17th chapter. And in the 18th chapter, he's brought before the throne of Saul by Abner. Abner is good man, righteous man. He is first cousin to Saul. And their fathers were brothers. And Abner is a righteous man, and he brings David and introduces him to Saul. And Saul hears the women singing after David kills Goliath. And the women are singing, Saul has killed his thousands, David his 10,000s, and Saul gets livid. So he starts trying to trick David in that 18th chapter. He says, you go out and you get me 100 foreskins of Philistines. That don't mean circumcise them. That meant emasculate them. Cut off their genitals and come and bring them before me. And the reason they would do that, because they'd know that's that many less of their enemies that are going to reproduce again. And David went out, and the reason Saul did that, he thought, surely, if I send, and he made David head of his bodyguard, and he said, if I send David out like this, he'll surely get killed. And he's jealous for his kingdom. Because the word is being whispered all over Israel. Samuel is gone. And see, Saul is told by Samuel in the 15th chapter, you're rejected by God. You're out. Well, David is just a shepherd boy. And I'm bringing you to a point on all of this. He's just a shepherd, but he's not some little pansy. I started to say this one night. I didn't finish it. Isn't it funny? All these pictures has got David in the 17th chapter as a skinny little shepherd boy. And then the very next day, when he's made captain of Saul's bodyguard, he's a strapping young warrior, you know. Just one day's time, he turns from this. No, he's the strapping young warrior. He's just not old enough to be in the army in the 17th chapter. He's very proficient with the sling. He could hit it. David knew he could kill Goliath. It wasn't, David didn't go, God, you guide my stone. No, David said, I can hit a hair's breadth at 50 yards. I'll bring that guy down. He's a lumbering giant. Don't worry about him. I've already, as a shepherd, killed a bear and a lion with my club. I beat him to death with it. I'll get him. He knew what he was doing. Well, here in the 19th chapter, Saul tries to get David killed by telling him to go get 100 foreskins of the Philistines, and David brings back 200 foreskins. And he says, whoever does this, I'll give him my oldest daughter to wife. She's a beautiful woman. What was her name? Merab. That's right, Merab. I was thinking of Michael. That was the other one. Merab. But she was given away while David's out fighting. So you get to the 19th chapter. The 19th chapter, Saul declares war on David. War. And David starts running for his life. Well, when you get to the 31st chapter, Saul, in the meantime, David is having run-in after run-in with Saul. And Saul has got thousands in his army. Thousands. And David's got 400 to 600 in his army. That's what he usually ran in his army. Now, David knew when he numbers Israel in the 24th chapter of 2 Samuel, and he got real proud about his mighty men from the 23rd chapter. That's the point we're getting at. Remember, if the king is obedient to God, he'll conquer his enemies, and it has nothing to do with numbers. So David is numbering out of pride. He's numbering Israel in the 24th chapter. But let's go back over here So whenever, right before, David has made friends with the Philistines, while Saul is chasing him, David goes over to the land of the Philistines, and he makes friends with a king named Achish. And Achish is one of the kings of the Philistines. So David has become buddies with the Philistines. And he tells King Achish, hey, I know you're going out to attack Saul tomorrow. Now Saul thinks David's trying to steal his throne. And David is still for Saul. You remember it says David was the reward. Here's the Philistines. And David is bringing up their rear. David and his armies, 400 to 600 men. And they're going up here to fight King Saul. And David says, I want you to, he goes to Achish and say, tell your Philistine friends, I want to bring up the rear as you go to fight Saul. What do you think David's motive is? He's going to sandwich the Philistines in between him and Saul. And regardless of how Saul feels about him, David says he's the Lord's anointed, and I will deliver him if I can. And so he asked Achish, can I go with y'all and bring up the rear? I would love to do this because I'm going to be this part of the sandwich. Saul's going to be the bread on the outside, and you're going to be the meat in the middle. That's what David is thinking. And let's go back to where we were. Over here in the 29th chapter of 1 Samuel. So the Philistines gathered together, and they're all fixing to go attack Saul. All their armies to Aphek in Israel. And the Israelites pitched by a fountain which is in Jezreel. And the lords of the Philistines passed on by hundreds and by thousands. But David and his men passed on in the rear. They took up the rear. Then said the princes of the Philistines, what do these Hebrews here? What's David doing back here behind us? We don't trust him. And Achish said unto the princes of the Philistines, is not this David, the servant of Saul, the king of Israel, which hath been with me these days and these years? Well, he's been spending a long time with us because Saul has been after him to kill him. Don't you know he's our friend? And I have found no fault in him since he fell unto me unto this day. And the princes of the Philistines were wroth with him. And the princes of the Philistines said unto him, make this fellow return. Make David go away. We don't trust him. You know what? They can't trust him. He'll deliver Saul from their hands if he can. And he could. That he may go again to his place which thou hast appointed him, and let him not go down with us to battle, lest in battle he be and Satan to us. The word is actually an adversary. The word is Satan in the original text. It's the same word as Satan provoked David to number Israel. You see, in the situation when David got proud, God was David's Satan. David made God an adversary to him. You see what I'm saying? For wherewith should he reconcile himself unto his master, should it not be with the heads of these men? Is not this David of whom they sang one to another in dances, saying, Saul slew his thousands and David his 10,000s? And didn't he slay one of our brothers, Goliath? In all the time that David was being pursued by Saul from 19 all the way up to prior to the 31st chapter, David didn't have that many people in his army. Look over here. Saul is chasing David in 1 Samuel 22. Let's look at 1 Samuel 22. In chapter 19, he starts chasing Saul. Saul starts chasing David. That's where Michal, David's wife, which was Saul's daughter, had David put a dummy in his bed and put a pillow and puffed it up and made it look like David, and she helped him to escape. Now, look here in 22. Look in 22. Now, David is on the run from Saul. He starts on the run in the 19th chapter, and he's running, and Saul nearly gets him trapped. Just about the time Saul would get him trapped, God would do something miraculous. Look here at 22 and verse 1. David therefore departed and escaped to the cave of Adullam. Now David was prior to this. He was at Nob with Ahimelech the priest, and he was at one of the schools of the prophets hiding out. And when his brethren and all his father's house heard it, they went down thither to him. Now this next verse is a picture of Christ. It's figurative picture of David being a picture of Christ in the Old Testament. And everyone that was in distress, and everyone that was in debt, and everyone that was discontented gathered themselves unto David and became captain over them. And there were with David about 400 men. And he's conquering Saul right and left with 400 men. Now I'm trying to show you something here. Remember, Israel could conquer anyone. It didn't have anything to do with numbers. But when David gets up here into the 24th chapter of 2 Samuel, he numbers Israel as though it was all these mighty men from the 23rd chapter that had done all this conquering. It didn't matter how many mighty men he had. He had 400 here. He had 400 men. And look at chapter 25, verse 13. 25. He's still on the run. Samuel has died in the first verse of this chapter. This is 2 years before the death of Saul. All right. 25, verse 13. And David said unto his men, Gird ye on every man his sword. And they girded on every man his sword, and David also girded on his sword. And there went up after David about 400 men, and 200 abode by the stuff. So he has grown to 600 men in his army, hasn't he? Saul's got thousands in his army, and Saul is chasing David, trying to kill him because he thinks David is trying to steal his kingdom. You see what I'm saying? So it doesn't have anything to do with numbers. And look over here in chapter 30, verse 10. Chapter 30, verse 10. But David pursued, he and 400 men, for 200 abode behind, which were so faint that they could not go over the brook Besor. So David's got 400 to 600 men while Saul is chasing him, and he's conquering him right and left. Not by David's righteous, Saul is unrighteous. Look over here and it's not the numbers that causes Israel to conquer their enemies, but it is their obedience, isn't it? Huh? That's what it is. So we can see that. Look over here. Let me show you something here in 1 Samuel 23. Go to 1 Samuel 23. Saul is chasing David. You can just say from the 19th chapter all the way to the end of the book. I call the book of 1 Samuel the book of Saul and David, and I call 2 Samuel the book of David because he's king all the way through that book. David is king in the eyes of God from the 16th chapter to the end of the book, but Saul is king in the eyes of the people. David is king in the eyes of God and all the people all the way through 2 Samuel. Now look here in 23:16. 23. Now David has He has gone to Ahimelech, looked for sustenance with Ahimelech. And when he does that, Saul comes to Ahimelech, the priest of God, and he's very displeased with David for this. He's very displeased with Ahimelech, and Saul wants to kill Ahimelech and 85 of the priests of God. I'll come back to that later. Well, David is on the run. And I've said last week that God does tricky things. God's very tricky when he wants to get something done. The way Israel would conquer was with the power, and God was manipulating men's lives. Look here in chapter 23, verse 16. Chapter 23. You see he's got 600 men in verse 13. See that? In verse 16, and Jonathan, David's son, arose and went to David into the wood and strengthened his hand in God and said unto him, Fear not, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find thee. Now Jonathan was Saul's son, and he loved David. He knew David was the king. He was submitting to David. And thou shalt be king over Israel. Jonathan knew that. He knew the law. He knew it. The king had to come out of Judah. Jonathan believed God with all his heart. He was truly one of the godliest men of the Old Testament Scripture. And he was the son of Saul. And I shall be next unto thee, that also my father knoweth. And they two made a covenant before the Lord, and David abode in the wood, and Jonathan went to his house. Then came up the Ziphites to Saul to Gibeah, saying, Doth not David hide himself with us in strongholds in the wood, in the head of Hekeliah, which is on the south of Jeshimon? Now therefore, O king, come down according to all the desire of thy soul, to come down and trap David. Now, the Ziphites are telling Saul how to find David. And Saul is going to go trap David with all of his thousands, and David's just got a few hundred men. I'm trying to show you why David numbered his army and why God brought this judgment on him. And this all goes back to what we're talking about. David doesn't have to number armies. It's not how many David has in his army, is it? And Saul said, Blessed be ye of the Lord, for ye have compassion on me. Go, I pray you, and prepare ye, and know, and see his place, where his haunt is. The word is regel. We talk about our haunt. Say, that's his old haunt. We're going to go to our haunting grounds. The word is regel. R-E-G-E-L. It means your walking place. Where your walk is. Where your journey is. And who hath seen him there? Now Saul is about to trap David. But David's got something on his side that Saul can't seem to get into his thick head. David has got God on his side. Saul's got thousands in his armies. David's got hundreds. And David loves Saul in spite of his ways. David wouldn't love Saul if he wasn't the elect of God. He loves him. Samuel loves Saul. Well, that's amazing, isn't it? And this man is acting like a horse's tail. He said, I want this kingdom. This is my kingdom. I built it, and I'm going to have it. You're not getting it. And he told Jonathan, he's trying to steal our kingdom. You're going to be the king after me, Jonathan. John's thinking, no, I'm not. David's king. See therefore and take knowledge of all the lurking places where David hides himself, and come again to me with the certainty exactly where he is, and I'll trap him. And I will go with you, and it shall come to pass, if he be in the land, that I will search him out throughout all the thousands of Judah. I'll get him and I'll trap him. And they arose and went to Ziph before Saul. But David and his men were in the wilderness of Maon, in the plain on the south of Jeshimon. And Saul also and his men went to seek him, and they told David Wherefore he came down into a rock and abode in the wilderness of Maon. And when Saul heard that, he pursued after David in the wilderness of Maon. He's about to get him trapped. When God is your king and he's head, the wildest things can happen, like in some NFL football game. Miracle play. And Saul went on this side of the mountain, and David and his men on that side of the mountain. And David made haste to get away for fear of Saul. For Saul and his men compassed David and his men round about to take them. They have them cornered. They're compassed around them. Saul's army has got David in check. I got you. God says, no, you don't. But there came a messenger unto Saul, saying, hasten thee and come back quickly to Jerusalem, for the Philistines have invaded the land. Guess who made the Philistines invade the land? That's God does that. So when God says you can whip your enemies when you're righteous, he says, I can manipulate the minds of the Philistines to make them invade the land at just the right time when you think you've got David cornered. You don't. And you would think David would remember this when he's an old man, wouldn't you? You would think he wouldn't count the number of the armies of Israel to say, see, we're so great because we're a great number. It has nothing to do with numbers with God. And neither does it with you and I as the church. We're spiritual Israel. It don't have anything to do with numbers. God can miraculously trick people, and that's what he does. Wherefore Saul returned from pursuing after David, and he had him trapped for sure. But he had to leave. The Philistines are invading the land. They'll be taken over before he gets back. Wherefore Saul returned from pursuing after David and went against the Philistines. Therefore they called that place Selah Hamalekath. And David went up from thence and dwelt in strongholds of En-gedi. He got away. I wonder what made him get away. Now let's go back over here to 2 Samuel, the 24th chapter. Now Saul is dead in the 34th chapter. Saul is killed at Mount Gilboa. We're not going to go into that. A lot of speculation as to whether he committed suicide or whether an Edomite killed him. Could have been both. He fell on his sword, and then he told a young man to thrust him through. Because Saul knew his days were over. He knew his day was numbered. I don't know that he wasn't in a repentant state of mind in those last few days, because the last time he got trapped, the last time, David was always catching him, wasn't he? He was hiding in a cave at one time, and David's got this ornery nephew. I mean, he was a mean cuss. That was his sister's sons, Joab and Abishai. David's sister was Zeruiah, and Zeruiah had two sons, and Joab was David's commanding general, and he was a murderer, but he was mean as a rattlesnake. Man, he'd go out and fight anything. He liked to kill people. And his brother was Abishai, and Abishai, everywhere David went, Abishai was his shadow. And Abishai was always saying, Uncle David, can I go kill somebody today? I want to go kill. Man, he'd like to just get in a fight. Give me my spear. Give me my sword. I want to kill somebody. And he was mean too. He could kill you. David said, these sons of Zeruiah are too hard for me. You guys are driving me crazy. Shut up. That's what they did to David. Joab and Abishai, it drove him nuts. In fact, Joab is his nephew that he recruited to have Uriah the Hittite killed. I always figured the reason David couldn't kill him because he's his nephew, first of all, and secondly, mainly, was because that was the one that he recruited to kill Uriah, and he would always feel guilty for having Joab killed. So when David stepped down from the throne, he went to Solomon and said, here's your cousin Joab. You do with him what you want to. I can't do nothing with him. He just walked away from him. Said, that's it. Joab's driving me crazy. Joab is one of my favorite characters. I went through the books of the Kings several years ago. Of all the guys in these two books, he's the only person that told David what to do. He was his nephew. He would chew David out at the drop of a hat and say, Uncle David, what are you weeping over your son for? I mean, and David would try to take... Joab was always killing somebody. David tried to get rid of him one day, and he took Abigail, his other sister, had a son named Amasa. He said, Amasa, I want to put you in the place of Joab, your cousin. I can't handle him no more. So Amasa starts heading up the army and says, come on men, follow me. And Joab sees Amasa one day and he says, come here, Amasa, come here, cuz. Goes and puts his arm around him. He said, how you doing, cousin? Well, hold this. And he kills Amasa's first cousin. And in so many words, he says, army, follow me, don't listen to David. And in so many words, he was saying, Uncle David, don't you ever try to pull that again. He was a man that was to be feared in Israel. Because Joab would kill you. I mean, just at the snap of a finger. He was mean, ornery. And David is just, it's driving him literally out of his mind. Now, but why was that happening to David? David has his little tryst with Bathsheba in the 11th chapter of 2 Samuel. In the 12th chapter of 2 Samuel, Nathan comes and stands before David and says there was a man that had a big flock of sheep. And one man down the road had one little ewe lamb. And the man with the big flock of sheep came and he had some people coming to visit him, and he went and took this one man's little ewe lamb and he slew it and fed his people with it. David says, who is that man? If I find out who that man is, I'll kill him. And Nathan said, thou art the man, David. He said, oh God, I've sinned before God. I took Bathsheba, didn't I? He said, you did. And Nathan told him in that 12th chapter of 2 Samuel, he said, from now on, the sword of God. David repented, but he said, the sword will never leave your house. And from that moment on, from the 12th chapter of 2 Samuel, all the way to the end of the book, David was in misery. Immediately in the 13th chapter of 2 Samuel, right after David has his affair with Bathsheba, the 12th chapter, Nathan the prophet comes to him and says, the sword will never leave your house, David. And the baby died there in the 12th chapter. In the 13th chapter, David's son Amnon lust after his sister Tamar. He plots and plans and gets her to come and feed him. And he says, I've got a fever and I'm sick. And he gets her into his room and he rapes his sister Tamar. And Absalom, their brother, hears about it. And Absalom is enraged at Amnon. Now this is all about this is about the sword never leaving David's house. And Absalom plots against Amnon. And they have a harvest. And at their harvest, they had these big parties where they would have all kinds of food and kill a lamb and kill a big bullock. And they would feed and feast. And 2 years later, Absalom went into his brother at this feast. And he killed him. He murdered his brother. And then he fled the land. And then Joab talked David into bringing, as the world turns, good night, the young and restless in Israel. Joab talks David into bringing Absalom back into the land, and Absalom gets back to the land. David said, "Oh, my son Absalom, I love you. I know you killed your brother, but I forgive you." So Absalom says, "Oh, I'm okay." Goes to the mirror one day, and he's got this long hair. He says, "Hey," and he's talking to the people around Israel, "I sure am popular. People like me better than my father." So he starts recruiting men to overthrow his father and kill his father. And one of the men is Ahithophel, who is just so happens to be Bathsheba's grandfather. And Ahithophel is David's chief counselor. Whew. And he turns on David. And then he goes to Absalom, and he goes and defects to Absalom. And Absalom and Ahithophel are getting together, and they're going to chase David out of Jerusalem. But before they go, Ahithophel tells Absalom what he wants him to do, and Absalom says, "I'm not listening to you." So Ahithophel goes home, and he sits down, and he writes down his last will and testament, commits suicide. You didn't know all of this rape and murder was in the Old Testament, did you? So he commits suicide, and then Absalom takes his armies and chases his father out of Jerusalem. And then they head off towards a city of refuge beyond the Jordan River. It's a place called Mahanaim. And David takes some men with him. Whew. He takes Joab and Abishai, doesn't he? Takes another man. What was his name? The Gittite. He took the Gittite, who was a general in his armies, and he's got these three men, the Gittite, and he's got Absalom and Joab, and then of course Absalom comes across the river, and David said, "If whatever you do, don't touch my boy. Don't touch Absalom." And Absalom, and God causes the army to come up against Absalom's army, and Absalom starts losing, and he runs for his life, and he hangs his hair. He hangs in a tree. He doesn't hang himself. He just gets tangled in a tree because he has this long hair that he likes everybody to look at him. And Joab comes up on him and says, "Ha, I got you." Joab don't pay any attention to David. David says, "Don't touch my son." And Joab says, "I don't care what David said." And he thrusts him through with spears. And then he goes back to Jerusalem and said, "Absalom's dead, Uncle David." David starts weeping and crying, "Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." And Joab says, "What are you crying over him for? He tried to take your kingdom." The only man that would chew David out like he was a stepchild. In all of David's life, I guess this thing that's happening at the end of 2 Samuel is David's last bid for any kind of attention or something, because his life is miserable. His life is miserable from the 12th chapter to the end of 2 Samuel. It's just, he's in misery. And the last thing he does is number Israel. And what he's doing, he's boasting. Let's go back to the 24th chapter of 2 Samuel. But remember, it wasn't how many was in his army when he was conquering Saul, was it? It was the miracles of God. And we don't sit around worrying about how many we have. This is not a matter of, well, y'all believe that predestination, that Christmas is pagan. Well, how many of y'all are there? We don't care how many there are. We side with God. He says it's true. And David's numbering Israel here. That's the whole idea of his numbering Israel. David, I don't know what's getting wrong with him. But boy, he's stepping down, and he just, I don't know, God provokes him to number Israel, probably just to show him, David, it has nothing to do with how many. Because remember I said in Deuteronomy 28, if you notice, everything Israel is going through, this is still about the 10 horns. Israel gave up their power when they went after Baal in the grove, didn't they? God caused David to overcome Saul. Saul was living unrighteously. David was the king of Israel, and he was living righteously. Do you know that's the only reason that David could kill Goliath? Because he had been made king of Israel in the 16th chapter of 1 Samuel, and he goes out against Goliath in the 17th chapter. He's the righteous king of Israel in the eyes of God. That's why he killed Goliath. There's no way Goliath could have killed him. Impossible. Now let's go back to the 24th chapter of 2 Samuel. How much time do I have? 30 seconds. I was going to give you this, and then I was going to go to something else. Let me just read a little bit of this. And David, in the 23rd chapter, he names all of these mighty men that he has. I'll just put it this way. He names all these mighty men in the 23rd chapter. This is though he's taking credit. Let's read a little bit of that 24th chapter. And the Lord moved David against them to say, go number Israel and Judah. And even if it was Satan, Satan is a sword in the hand of God, isn't he? So any bidding that Satan does David to do, it's God that's doing it. David himself said, deliver me from the wicked, which is thy sword in thy hand. And David was a Satan to the Philistines, wasn't he? He was an adversary. So David is an adversary to God right here. Let's read this. Go number Israel and Judah. For the king said to Joab, the captain of the host, which was with him, go now through all the tribes of Israel, from Dan even to Beersheba, and number ye the people, that I may know the number of the people. And Joab said unto the king, now the Lord thy God add unto the people, how many soever they be, 100-fold, and that the eyes of my Lord the king may see it. But why doth my king, the Lord the king, delight in this thing? Because David knew he was never to number Israel to show his power and his authority. Notwithstanding, the king's word prevailed against Joab and against the captains of the host. And Joab and the captains of the host was the armies of Israel, went out from the presence of the king to number the people of Israel. And they passed over Jordan and pitched in Arior, and the right side of the city that lieth in the midst of the river Gad, and between Jazer. Then they came to Gilead and to the land of Tatim-Hadshi, and they came to Danjahan and to Sidon, and they came to the stronghold of Tyre, that's up in the north, and to all the cities of the Hivites and the Canaanites, and they went out to the south of Judah, even to Beersheba, that's the southernmost city. So when they had gone through all the land, they came to Jerusalem at the end of 9 months and 20 days. And Joab gave the sum of the number of the people unto the king. And there were in Israel 800,000 valiant men that drew the sword. And the men of Judah were 500,000 men. So they've got 1,300,000 in Israel in their army. And it's as though David is taking credit. It doesn't have anything to do with 1,300,000 because David was winning when he had 400 to 600, wasn't he? And Israel is going to win when they're obedient. And David's heart smote him that he had numbered the people. And David said unto the Lord, I have sinned. I have taken credit. I have boasted in all these mighty men of chapter 23. You can read 23 and he's naming off these great men he had in his army. God said, it don't take great men. It takes me. David didn't deliver himself when Saul had him cornered there, did he? No, God delivered him by making the Philistines attack Israel. And he said, I beseech thee, O Lord, take away the iniquity of thy servant, for I have done very foolishly. For when David was up in the morning, the word of the Lord came unto the prophet Gad, David's seer. David had another prophet named Nathan. Now he's got one named Gad telling him what's for. Saying, God told me to come to you, David, saying, go and say unto David, thus saith the Lord. Now, Kenneth Copeland won't like these verses here because he says God won't make anybody sick and God don't kill anybody. God comes to David and says to him, "Thus saith the Lord, I offer thee 3 things, David. Choose thee one of them, that I may do it unto thee." So Gad came to David and told him and said unto him, "Shall 7 years of famine come unto thee in the land?" I'm going to give you a choice of 3 things because of this wickedness in your heart. You want 7 years of famine? Or will you flee 3 months before your enemies, while they pursue thee? Or that there be 3 days pestilence? And that'll be my pestilence, David. Which one of these 3 do you want? I'm going to kill people in Israel. That's what God is saying. And Kenneth Copeland says God won't kill anybody. He won't make them sick. I think pestilence is sickness, isn't it? He says, 3 days pestilence in the land. Now advise and see what answer I shall return to him that sent me. And David said unto Gad, I am in a great strait. Man, I don't know what to choose. Innocent men are going to die in Israel because of my sin. People say, God wouldn't kill anybody. God wouldn't kill innocent people. Yes, he will. He might kill your own kids for the way you act, the way you live. I am in a great strait. Let us fall now in the hand of the Lord, for his mercies are great. So God says, aha, you want 3 days of pestilence. And let me not fall into the hand of man. So the Lord sent a pestilence. The Lord sent the pestilence, not Satan, the Lord. Kenneth Copeland, you knucklehead. T.D. Jakes, you guys don't know what you're talking about. Jesse the plant, he's got the IQ of a plant. So the Lord sent a pestilence upon Israel from the morning even to the time appointed 3 days later. And there died of the people from Dan even to Beersheba 70,000 men. God killed 70,000 innocent men because of David's sin. People say, God wouldn't do that. Yes, he will. Watch out what he'll do when we're disobedient to him. He'll take a ball bat and wrap you upside the head for about 25 years. He'll do it every day for that long. Well, he's done it to me. He got my attention. And when the angel stretched out his hand upon Jerusalem to utterly destroy it, this is the angel of the Lord, probably Michael. The Lord repented him of the evil. He turned. The word repent means to turn. God said, that's enough. I've killed enough people in Israel. And said to the angel that destroyed the people, that's enough. Stay now thine hand. I've killed 70,000 people, God said, with a pestilence, with a sickness. And the charismatics said, God won't make you sick, don't they? When he sends a pestilence and kills you, I think that's pretty sick, isn't it? Death is a permanent sickness. And the angel of the Lord was by the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. This has to be Jerusalem. And David spake unto the Lord when he saw the angel that smote the people and said, Lo, I have sinned and I have done wickedly, but these sheep, what have they done? These 70,000 you killed, they haven't done anything, God. God says, that's what you get. You're the king. You're responsible. I hold you accountable for it. Ooh-wee. God holds you accountable for your children. Do you know that? Watch out what he'll do to them when you're not obedient to him. Let thine hand, I pray thee, be against me and against my father's house. And Gad came that day to David and said unto him, Go up, rear an altar unto the Lord in the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. The Jebusites was the place where Jerusalem sat. The temple is not going to be built till the next book. I believe that where David offered this sacrifice was the exact spot. It's the Jebusites. It was his nephew Joab that attacked the place of the Jebusites, and that was the land of Jebus, and they renamed it Jerusalem. So this is where Jerusalem is. And David, according to the saying of Gad, went up as the Lord commanded. And Araunah looked and saw the king and his servants coming on toward him. And Araunah went out and bowed himself before the king on his face upon the ground. And Araunah said, Wherefore is my Lord King David come to his servant? And David said, To buy the threshing floor of thee, to build an altar unto the Lord, that the plague may be stayed from the people. I've got to offer up sacrifice to God for what I have done. And Araunah said unto David, Let my lord the king take and offer up what seemeth good unto him. Behold, here be oxen for burnt sacrifice, and threshing instruments, and other instruments of the oxen for the wood. And all these things did Araunah as a king gave unto a king. And Araunah said unto the king, The Lord thy God accept thee. And the king said unto Araunah, Nay, but I will surely buy it of thee at a price. Neither will I offer burnt offerings unto the Lord my God of that which doth cost me nothing. It's not sacrifice in your life if it doesn't cost you something. If it don't cost your money, your time, it's not sacrifice. Your work. I like that verse. Read it again. The king said unto Araunah, Nay, I will surely buy it of thee at a price. Araunah said, Take it for free. And David said, No, I will not offer burnt offering unto the Lord my God of that which doth not cost me anything. So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen for 50 shekels of silver. And David built there an altar unto the Lord, and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. So the Lord was entreated for the land, and the plague that God brought on the land was stayed from Israel. I wanted you to see that David, even as he got older, thought it was his numbers. It never was numbers, was it? It was obedience that made you conquer your enemies. Boy, it sure is easy as you get older, if you're not careful, to forget the blessing of God and how it came. We can't take credit for that. I'm going to come back and talk more about this next week. I've got so many illustrations out of the Old Testament I want us to see. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your truth. Help us to understand that it's not in numbers that we win. Lord, it's our obedience that causes us to conquer our enemies. And Lord, we won't conquer them the way we want to. You'll bring some miraculous way in our life, in your time and your way. And it may even be in a time when we're not particularly interested in seeing our enemies brought down, but in your time, you'll do it your way. Cause us to continue this work, to do what you'd have us to do, and we'll give you the praise and glory for all things. In Christ's name we pray, amen. Wasn't it amazing how much things you can tie together with these 10 horns?
Chaos, whenever you mentioned the dirt of chaos,
Uh-huh.
and how chaos is essentially just a lie. Chaos is based on ignorance of God's implicit order.
Chaos, it's a mixture. It's a mushing of God's order. That's what it is.
Yeah, it's like we can't see the big picture of God's order, and we view things as being chaotic.
Yeah.
And it's based on our ignorance. So essentially you have a lie, and of course the lie is destroyed by truth, and our flesh, which is made of the chaos dirt.
Yeah, and that's true. And our chaos, this flesh, is what corrupts our lives.